Just hold it in the middle, and we'll just
Right in front of
film.
Yeah, just
Lower. Yep.
Yeah.
Right there. That's great.
Solid.
Great.
thanks.
Everyone got it?
Yeah.
So, position where I can't move.
Great. Let's make sure Drew's out of there. All right, so Drew's out of there. So all of this gets edited, so whatever we say, we can unsay it. Okay? So anyway, first let me just welcome everybody to the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and we'll thank them very much for lending us this nice space. Agustin, okay. Agustin.
That's already above average.
See,
Even your first one was. Yeah.
We're going to let him introduce himself, okay?
All right.
But he and I were both fellows here in the Radcliffe Fellowship Program at some point in the last decade, and we can talk about Radcliffe another time. But let's have everybody just introduce themselves and where you came from and what your connection to all of this is. And so the students can introduce themselves as Harvard freshmen and that you took the seminar. And anyway, so Elizabeth, we'll let you go first, and you could just talk to us.
Okay.
And before you start, just one thing. I think get ISOs of both of the people. So like if you have her and him, and then you have her.
I
ISO.
can't.
Because I just realized
my lens isn't close enough. It's never gonna be an ISO.
Okay, but I mean like as you know, I mean just like a one-on, because I'm just noticing if I'm the only one shooting those two, it's always gonna be. Do you know what I mean?
I'm actually never gonna have an ISO really. So.
Okay. Well.
But is it framed as a one shot or a two shot?
It's a 2 because at the 70, they're both in there.
Okay.
Oh, they're both in. Okay, cool. All
Do you
right,
want us to move?
No, you're fine.
No, it's not your-
Between
Okay.
and
Okay. So,
And do you, Jared, do you want people to, like when they introduce themselves, you want them to talk to one camera or what?
just talk to you. I think.
Yeah,
Should be
yeah,
fun
just
for
talk-
you.
yeah.
But like, I know who she is, so like it's weird that she's introducing
well-
herself to me.
But she'll be on an ISO shot over here.
yeah.
So.
All right, go ahead.
Okay, I'm Elizabeth Holmes. I'm from San Antonio, Texas, and I took the Prediction Freshman Seminar with Alyssa in the fall semester.
I'm Agustin Rayo. I'm a philosopher at MIT, and I grew up in Mexico City.
And you all know me already.
My name is Cassandra Kane. I'm from Boston, Massachusetts, and I'm also a freshman studying at Harvard and participated in the freshman seminar last semester.
And I realized, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that because people could watch this in an isolated way. So hi, I'm Alyssa Goodman, and I'm both the host of the Prediction Project here at Harvard and Harvard X, and as part of that, I teach a freshman seminar with fine students like Cassandra and Elizabeth here, and they were particularly interested in the philosophical aspects of prediction, and so we've invited them here today to talk to a card-carrying philosopher, even if he's from MIT, my alma mater, plug. Anyway, and they've prepared some questions, and so why don't we start with some of the students' questions, in particular the ones that we've highlighted would be good. And let's go eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and let's start with you, Cassandra.
I mean, Cassandra does have the right name to talk about prediction.
Yes.
Sure does.
Yeah, my father was well aware of the associations. So I guess one thing that we had discussed pretty thoroughly during our seminar was the idea of just how predictable human behavior was, and that was something particularly interesting to me. So we kind of discussed, you know, from different aspects, like biological, if it's in our DNA where we don't have the free will to do certain actions, or on a philosophical level. So I guess I was interested in your opinion about, you know, how predictable are human beings, and, you know, to what lengths would we be able to predict their actions?
There was this moment when I was learning philosophy when I felt like the scales fell from my eyes about this issue. Ooh. Because I think the answer is, yes, we are extremely predictable. So here's an example. I was able to predict that I would find Alyssa in this building today at just the right time, on the basis of like some weird images on my screen. And it's so much more than that. You know, like you go on a plane and you're able to predict like where the pilot is going to take the plane. And I feel like our entire ability to live as a society is based on the fact that we are very predictable.
Does that mean that we're well behaved or that we're predictable? I'm serious.
I mean, I think it means that we are all engaged in a practice which allows for a high level of predictability. Of of course, that doesn't mean that we couldn't opt out of that practice if we wanted. So for example, Alyssa might have failed to show up today, and then my prediction would have not worked. But I mean, I think that the only reason we're blinded to how much we do by way of predicting what we're going to do is because it's so commonplace. It just doesn't surprise us that we find our friends in exactly the cafe we predicted they would be on the basis of a phone call.
But what about when you go out farther in time? 10 years from now, you don't know where I'm going to be, do you?
No. But here's something that philosophers do think about. So, is the universe a deterministic place? And of course, people's knee-jerk reaction is no, because quantum mechanics is indeterministic, and therefore the universe is not deterministic. But actually, that's not so clear. So, I mean, it is clear that on the standard Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, you get indeterminism. But that is not the only respectable interpretation of quantum mechanics. So, for example, an Bohmian interpretation of quantum mechanics, which in my opinion is the most beautiful and therefore most plausible one, the world is fully deterministic. So, for someone who has full information about the initial conditions, or indeed about the state of the universe at any given time, it's in principle possible to issue full predictions about what's going to happen at every other time, including Alyssa's whereabouts in 10 years.
I also had just a follow-up question. I think so some of the examples you talked about were sort of predicting external behaviors, like, where you're going to expect someone else to be, or what do you think will happen in the future. But in terms of predicting your own behavior, I guess I was more interested in like an individual level of, how much are you able to predict like what you're going to do or how you will behave, kind of getting into the whole like free will deterministic.
Oh, that's so interesting. I mean, here I'm answering not as a philosopher, but just as a human being. I mean, I think it's surprising how bad I am at predicting my own behavior as compared to just predicting the behavior of other people I know well. So I think the answer is I'm not much better.
Do you think other people can predict your behavior better than you can?
I think that for certain things, my wife is much better at predicting my behavior than I am. Though I don't pretend to be bringing any philosophical expertise.
I wasn't going to bring this up like at all or too soon, but is this better at predicting your behavior than your wife? And is this a problem? I'll take it away now. I don't want a product placement. Anyway.
I mean, I would not be surprised if for certain aspects of my behavior it was.
Right, so in all seriousness, like my question that ties in, and we'll get back to everybody else's questions in a second, but Ben Schneiderman is coming next week, and we're going to interview him too, and he's giving a talk about algorithmic accountability and how we're really worried about artificial intelligence just running amok, and we don't know what's doing what. And so, for now, these things are novelties and helpful and et cetera, but Skynet, when do they start predicting our behavior for us to the point where they determine it?
Oh, no, to a scary degree.
Right.
I mean, of course, it may not get to 100%, but it doesn't have to be at 100% to be scary. And also, even if for each particular person there's a fair chance that you'll get it wrong, I bet that pretty quickly we're going to get to the point where if you look at a large population, then you're going to be able to make very good predictions about what most people are going to do.
And that actually is how quantum mechanics works too, but we'll get back to that after we hear what Elizabeth's most burning question is.
So I saw that you did a lot of work with language in your own studies. So I was wondering how the specific wording of predictions can change how people may perceive them.
I don't know, but I do think that philosophers' work on language is relevant to the question of prediction. May I bloviate about that?
Yes.
Okay. So, Alyssa and I were actually just talking about this. So here is a very natural picture of language, and I think a mistaken picture of language. So each word is like a little box, and in that box you put a meaning, and then you build a sentence by concatenating some boxes, and then you hand over the sequence of boxes to your listener, and they open the boxes and recover the meanings that were put inside, and that's how they know what you said. I think that that is completely wrong. I think what happens is that speakers use a lot of sensitivity to context and common sense to figure out what other people are saying. So I think that a good first approximation to what we do is something like, suppose that the party is in one of the houses in front of you, and one is blue and one is red, and you're not sure which, and I know which one, but I'm not allowed to speak. Instead, I have some color cards. So if I raise the red color card and not the blue one, then I will probably get you to see that the party is in the red house. And that was just prediction. So I predicted that by doing that, you would get the message. And you predict on the basis of the message that if you go to the red house, you'll get to the party. So in other words, what we did is we used information about the context and information about our shared ways of thinking about the world to make fairly good predictions with no words about what other people are thinking. And I think that language, the way it really works, not this box model I was talking about, is very prediction-based too. We just know enough about one another and about context that we're very good at predicting how our words are going to be interpreted. So I think that's another example of our entire social world being based on the fact that we're actually very good at predicting what we're going to do.
Well, sometimes we predict what we want to hear, right? And I think to some extent, that, like Emma Dench, we interviewed her, and we were talking about ancient Rome, and there's this famous prediction where they say an empire will fall, right? And of course, the Romans think it's the enemy's empire, but it's the Roman Empire, okay? So, but if you hear those words, they're kind of vague. Which empire, right? And so you hear what you want to hear. And I'm wondering if that was a little bit the nature of your question.
No, I absolutely. I think that hits it on the head.
Yeah.
So I think part of the reason our language is not like meanings in little boxes is that our language is vague. And I think that it's absolutely crucial that our language be vague. So the fact that it's vague doesn't make it worse, it makes it better. Because it means that we can use very few words very flexibly to convey a lot of information. And because we're using vague words, we have to issue predictions about which of the many ways in which they could be interpreted is the one that the listener is going to pick. So in other words, if I'm to communicate effectively with you in saying an empire is going to fall, I need to make a prediction about how you're going to take it.
Right.
So that's right. So there's this intrinsic connection between vagueness in language and prediction.
This is really interesting because we've talked about so many different predictive systems in talking to other people, and the one that comes to mind now is IFA. So did I mention IFA divination in the class? So right, so IFA is the one with the shaking the pebbles in the sand tray, but the thing that's really important is that's one of these human diviner systems where the person who's doing the IFA divination is this expert who's trained for something like 15 years and memorized all this poetry and knows the people who are getting the prediction very, very, very closely. And so on the one hand, you could say he's telling them or she's telling them whatever they want to hear, but on the other hand, you could say that the person who knows them very personally knows what they're going to think of because the way that it works is that the stones point to some passage in these poems which are in the person's head. They then recite all this for the people, but then they also interpret it for them. And so you have a sort of formalized looking system, but then you have this very contextualized description of what's going on.
And also, one thing you said just now I think is important, and it reminded me of something you said before we started, which is that it's a fact about our language that sometimes it's much easier to communicate with people we know really well. Mm-hmm. And I think the reason is that we're much better at predicting how people who we know really well are going to react.
This is true. This is true. We were talking, and I have a question for the youngest people in the room, okay? We were also talking about texting versus talking on the phone versus talking in person. And to me, I think texting can be misinterpreted a lot more easily than talking in person. And we'll just leave talking on the phone, which your generation basically doesn't do, as far as I can tell, out of it. And so, I mean, if you're really good at texting, like if you were born in the texting age, is texting just as clear contextually as as talking in person?
I mean, I guess it's kind of just become a language of its own almost, like, especially through like emojis or just different, you know, phrases that, I mean, I can only speak as a 19-year-old, but for young people, I think a lot of texting is definitely not the same as having like a conversation face-to-face with someone, but I do think that there's a lot that can be communicated that you can't necessarily communicate talking face-to-face through texting. So even though you do lose a lot.
Yes, you're right, because you lose a lot, but you gain
Yeah.
not having to take as much of a risk, I think, right? At some level, you can kind of say what you mean and hope the person interprets it a particular way, but you're kind of covered that they might interpret it a different way.
Yeah, there's this, I mean, I think there's this sort of playfulness with, you know, having, I mean, obviously it's constricting not being able to see them face to face, but there's also like, you can be kind of playful with it. Like it also allows you to kind of communicate in ways that maybe would be more difficult to communicate face to face.
You're right, and that kind of gets to your question. I see where you're going there, because like if somebody gives a prediction, say somebody gave you a prediction entirely in emojis, okay? This is a very interesting thought exercise, okay? You could interpret that to mean a lot of different things, right?
Yeah.
Unless you knew the person really well, and then it's maybe a more restricted set of things.
I would say like, you can get into trouble though when one person is understanding it in a playful context and the other person is understanding it in a serious context. I think you lose a lot with lots of like inflection and tone of voice and emotion. So someone could say something as a joke and the other person could take it seriously if you don't have that built up context. So I think it almost depends on the conversation that you're having.
This is beautiful, because what I want to do is bring the conversation back to this determinism. You know, this is where I'm going to play the physicist card, okay? But if you think about the extension of this, right? So the most understandable conversation is probably between two people who have known each other, you know, maybe very intimately for a long time, and they're speaking a language that's their native language, and they're talking about things that they both know about, right? Let's say is that a good example? And then you sort of progress through those people texting, and then maybe, you know, people who don't know each other texting in cryptic sentences, or not even sentences, and then you get to machines trying to interpret, say, cryptic text or cryptic language. And they do that often by machine learning, okay? And the machine learning works by finding patterns that are often associated, and I'm sure people do this too, in how they learn to talk. But they find patterns that then they think mean something, and they don't attribute even meaning to the individual words, okay? And so they're gonna algorithmically determine what you're trying to mean. And I think that that's really fraught and dangerous if you don't do it right. Although, you know, going back to the I dropped it, but you know, am I worried about the Apple Watch and, you know, us being monitored by machines all the time? Yeah, okay. So let's say they're going to get a lot better at that. Okay? But this concept of data being able to kind of determine what's going on and to be used in predictions. To come back to what you were saying about quantum mechanics, what is true in both the natural language processing and in quantum mechanics is that if you have enough data, you can make statistical predictions about what's going to happen in the future. And people are notoriously bad at individually understanding statistics, which is partially why all this algorithmic accountability stuff is an issue, because people can't understand what's being done with this huge amount of data. So I'm just curious what everybody thinks about how well we think people understand and think about giving yourself over to a kind of computerized, data-oriented world where something is maybe making helpful predictions for you about, say, traffic, but also could be making unhelpful predictions for you about some horrible dystopian future where you may only marry the person who this algorithm has determined is exactly right for you. So, I don't know.
I mean, one thing that scares me is that things are changing very fast. So, I mean, what you're describing strikes me as a tool, and like all tools, it can be used for good or for evil. And I think that if it's introduced relatively slowly, then we can learn to defend ourselves against the bad things. For example, via regulation. But if it's introduced so fast that you know it's there before we can really understand how it's able to harm us, then I do get very scared.
Right. But I wonder, I mean, the same way that when people in the ancient world, you know, were offered interesting systems like an Oracle of Delphi or something like that, and I'm not sure that they sat around worrying about exactly how these predictions were made. They were just sort of looking for an answer, right? And I think right now, certainly when I use Google Maps and I try to find out the traffic forecast, I actually know how they make it, and I think that's really interesting, but I think most people don't, and I don't worry about that on a day-to-day basis. And so I totally agree with you that if we go slowly and know what we're doing, and it's the know what we're doing part, even the experts, that's really dangerous, we can probably fend this off. Maybe, okay. But I mean, do you worry about this on a day-by-day basis, or you just kind of go on with life?
I wouldn't say I worry too much about it. I guess it's not something I think about that often, but I think something I just begun thinking about was, you know, while it would be great for these things to kind of come more slowly towards us, I was just kind of thinking about like tech culture and just, you know, if you're in Silicon Valley and you're working at some startup, like it's about like constant growth. It's about like doubling your profits every year. It's about like, you know, being ahead of the next person. So it feels like we're kind of in this age and culture where, you know, even though it would be better for like the greater whole if we kind of took things a little bit more slowly and made sure everyone, you know, understood what was going on and didn't just treat it as a black box, like they actually understood what they were getting themselves into.
And you're interested in being a computer science major, so you know about this,
It just seems like the way that tech culture has become, it just really seems, it just seems to really like conflict with each other. So it makes me a little.
Facebook, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
Yeah, I'm actually taking a seminar this semester on science and feminism, and we actually just talked about AI last week, so it's kind of the perfect timing for this conversation. And one thing we talked about is how people place a lot of faith in artificial intelligence. They kind of take it as like gospel, but artificial.
And it's kind of like an oracle who can see the future.
Exactly.
Yes,
One thing that they said is we should use it more as a tool to help us rather than something as an absolute. But something else is that the knowledge that we give it is often shaped by our universe, which I think is like in many ways inherently flawed. So we talk about ways that like bias and racism is incorporated into some AI systems. Like they use AI to, you know, recommend criminal sentences, and often will give heavier criminal sentences to people of color than Caucasian people.
If the historical data has that bias.
Exactly. So like historical data can shape the way that AI operates. So I think right now we treat AI like this oracle, this kind of god that knows everything, but I think that people need to learn exactly like how it's created, and that the predictions it's made is based largely on like historical data.
Well, actually, a friend of mine brought this up recently and was talking about how the past is used to inform the future. And so that can be very formalized in the kind of systems you're talking about, or it can be more philosophical about, you know, how people think about the past and how that informs the future. And then also how people, this is a very philosophical question, how people reform their version of the past when thinking about a particular future, especially one that they want to happen. And so, how should we think about that? Or how should we think about thinking about that?
I don't know.
I don't know. Okay.
A philosopher doesn't.
But people do that. You know, where the famous phrase, you know, revisionist history, where they really want to like somebody and they want to just sort of ignore all the bad things that someone had done, or the opposite. You know, when you're sort of influenced by other people around you. So I've been talking too much. Does anybody want to ask more specific questions? You guys have more questions? Let me just look at my notes here for a second. Don't worry, we'll cut all this out. Let's see.
I think you should say something about the ultimate predictor.
I will in a second. About physics, you mean?
About physics.
Yes, I will in a second. Okay, we did have one question, but I'm not sure we can really ask your second question here.
I felt like we kind of started talking about that, so I guess this is kind of a good transition into discussing it. In terms of, you know, how people receive predictions, I guess I was curious on your opinion about, you know, whether and this also ties into the AI material we were discussing, do people rely too heavily on predictions, or do they not rely enough, or how should, you know, people approach?
You mean so they don't have to make too many decisions?
Yeah, I guess. So there's like two extreme ends of, you're either like not trusting any sort of prediction where you just base everything on what your own experience, which is dangerous, or, you know, completely doing whatever a prediction tells you, in which case you're not, it's another extreme.
I mean, the ways in which I use predictions in my life seem so varied that I don't think I can give one answer. So for example, when it comes to the weather, and I just trust the forecast 100%. Like I don't even look outside. I just look at the forecast and that's how I dress. And you know, at least in the East Coast United States, it rarely fails. So I think that's a good strategy. But you know, I think that other forms of prediction are not that reliable, or I feel queasier about, and you know, then it's important for me to you know, make up my own mind. So one example of this is like my mother thinking like she knows what I'm going to do. That, you know, I just like I don't feel comfortable making a decision just because she thinks that that's what I'm going to do, and I feel like, you know, I need to, you know, think through it on my own, maybe for personal reasons.
Right. I think, right, it's context dependent, like the language.
Context dependent.
But you bring up something really interesting that will get us back to physics as you wish,
All right.
Which is uncertainty. Okay, so you said you rely on the weather forecast 100%, which is not a good idea, okay? But close to 100% is a good idea. And weather forecasts, it's funny because that's a notorious example of something that's gotten more and more accurate, especially over just the last 20 years. And that has to do with more data and more sophisticated computers and models, and that's all great. We'll talk about that another time. But that's an example of something where it's really relevant to your everyday life. It relies on a lot of physics, which is not perfectly predictable, but if you give it enough examples, it will be right in the short term most of the time, okay? But I never, like there are people who are having a wedding or something and they're looking at the 10-day weather forecast and they're looking 10 days out. That is a bad idea, okay? And the reason is because even if we got really, really much better at predicting the weather, 10 days is pretty far out on the horizon of what is even predictable, because some of what you were saying before about quantum mechanics is true, some of it is not true. And that sort of, you know, if a bird flaps its wings or a butterfly flaps its wings, whatever, you know, how does that change the environment hundreds, thousands of miles away, days later? Okay, not very much is the answer, okay? But there are all these different processes that interact with each other, and they interact with each other in stochastic and kind of unpredictable random ways. And those things kind of multiply over time. And so again, statistically, you can say what the most likely thing is to happen, but you can't necessarily say what the exactly the right thing that's going to happen is. And there's a whole, you know, there are many fields of physics that are about predicting the predictability of something ultimately. But the one thing that we, minus the fact that we don't know what dark matter or dark energy are, but anyway, other than that, the parts of quantum mechanics that we do understand, you know, you have this famous Heisenberg uncertainty principle that everybody thinks means something that it doesn't mean. It only means that you can isolate something in space or in time, but not both with infinite accuracy, okay? So when you get to that, or when you get to the level of subatomic particles, which also fall to that principle, you can't say exactly what's going to happen on the tiniest scale, and quantum mechanics is limiting in that sense. And you know, Laplace, right? We talked about Laplace's demon in the class, and Laplace thought thought what you said before, which is that if you give somebody the exact initial conditions of some process, and you give them godlike powers to predict physics, that they could predict the future fate of the universe. But I would think most physicists today would disagree with that, for the two reasons I just mentioned. One is at the very fundamental particle level, you do have this uncertainty principle that we don't know how to get around. And then the second one, which sort of builds on that, is that there are these kind of multiplicative processes that will run away exponentially in terms of the uncertainty, because you don't know this a little bit and you don't know that a little bit, and then they interact with each other, and then you really don't know the product, and then the product of those two interacts with the product of something over here, and then you sort of multiply this tiny amount of uncertainty over and over and over again. And so, you know, that's why when you have a hurricane track, you know, the farther out in time, the bigger it gets, because those multiplicative processes get worse. And so I don't think we can ever get to the point, even physicists, or even if we had, you know, infinite knowledge of physics, that we could do this.
Wait, but are you... So as a matter of practice, of course, you're right. But I mean, just as a matter of principle, I mean, suppose that a Bohmian interpretation of quantum mechanics is correct, and that someone had an exact specification of the wave.
Do away with the uncertainty principle.
I mean, it's
okay. We could do that. It's fine. Might as well. I told you, we don't know what 95% of the universe is anyway. So, what a physicist? No, it's okay.
You know exactly what the wave is, and you know exactly the position and momenta of the particles are. I mean, you just apply the equations, you'll be able to make a prediction. Of course, I don't claim that they would be easy or even possible in practice to know what the wave is like or position and momenta of the particles. But I mean, it's just a point about the nature of the equations.
Right. I mean, it's very interesting to think about that, and that kind of gets to the basic science versus applied science. I don't know what the debate is there, but it's like right now that's just so far from possible, right? And the question is whether it's ever possible, and then it reaches that borderline between physics and philosophy to actually answer that. It's right here to actually answer that question. But I'm curious. I mean, if we just go back to uncertainty itself, like if we talk about the hurricane paths and stuff, how do you think? I mean, how do you all think that just general people this is sort of veering a little bit off of philosophy now, but we talked about that in the seminar too. And like, do you think that people understand, like at a conceptual level, why a cone of uncertainty exists as a hurricane path goes forward in time? I think most people get that and they know why, or am I deluding myself that they would understand those beautiful data visualizations so easily?
I don't think people truly understand it.
Yeah.
And it kind of goes back. I don't think people really realize like how much of what we know is prediction rather than gospel or fact. So like you say, the weather forecast. I think a lot of people, like I know I'm like you. I just look at the forecast and take it as a definite.
It's going to happen.
So I think people don't really realize that it's a prediction being made, not a certainty. Right. And then that kind of does away with any need for the cone of uncertainty because they think that it has to go the hurricane has to go in the path that it's going to go. So I don't think people really understand that. My grandparents didn't evacuate in Florida when there was a hurricane because they're like, it's not going to hit us.
Well, I mean, it brings you to just like what people think of statistics in general. So in other words, like those hurricane charts always have contours of something. They usually don't say what they are, right? But it's like darker in the middle and then lighter toward the edge. And those are usually like a 1 sigma uncertainty in the model and a 2 sigma and a 3 sigma. But they don't label that, and it's not even clear what it is. And, I mean, that you can actually predict the uncertainty in these forecasts. But when it comes to things like, say, elections, okay? People talk about probabilities of candidates winning. You know how many people thought that the 2/3, 1/3 Nate Silver prediction for the, Hillary's chances versus Trump's chances were that Hillary had 2/3 of the vote and Trump had 1/3 of the vote? Most people did not understand that there was a 2/3 chance Hillary would win and a 1/3 chance Trump would win. And that's like about the simplest form of this that you can have. And so I actually have some concern that we should do a really good job in this online version of prediction to explain uncertainty and statistics. But I mean, what's the best explanation that you could offer?
Well, just one other thing I kind of wanted to mention, and it's something Elizabeth had talked about a little bit earlier about another thing. I mean, myself and I think a lot of people sort of also fail to think about, where the data is coming from. I think weather is a little bit of a different example because we've had years of weather data, so that stuff is pretty reliable. But as opposed to, a lot of things that people cite as sources or, what they read online or just the information they take in, most people don't necessarily look into, okay, where did they get this information, where did they get this data, what kind of statistical test did they use to test this. So in terms of just reliability in general, I think that's also a big flaw or a big challenge that a lot of people face in terms of, because they inform what they believe or what they think or what they predict will happen by, the information in the media that they consume. So because there's so much unreliable information out there and like a lot of people don't necessarily put in the effort to, check where the data is
And that's so
coming
interesting
from.
because remember we talked about the framework in the class and we talked about the different kinds of prediction that you can have and sometimes they rely on people and now they rely mostly on data with some interpretation by people, but at least when they relied on people, kind of like Augustine's mother, you know, he knows her and he knows how to treat her prediction and how to kind of filter the uncertainty by what she might be saying, but people don't know that very well, even for hurricanes and weather.
One thing that's worth pointing out is
For
that
data, yeah.
sometimes I think it's a good idea to trust a prediction and just go with what it says, even if you know it's not 100% reliable. I think all it takes is that it be more reliable than any of the other methods. So we were talking earlier about the weather. You're of course right that it's not right 100% of the time,
Right.
but it is better than all my
Than
other
guessing,
possibilities.
or than the
well, certainly than
almanac.
guessing, but also than just looking outside.
That's true, that's true.
Which is why I
This is
think
Boston, it's sunny outside,
That's
it
right.
could snow at any minute, we should check.
Which is why I think one should trust it, always,
Okay.
even if it's not 100% accurate. And I think that's true of going to the doctor as well. So the doctor is making a prediction about you know, what's going to happen if you do nothing, what's going to happen if you follow these treatments. And of course, doctors are wrong very, very frequently. But that's not the issue. The issue is whether they are wrong more frequently than any of our other advisors or not.
It's true, except that beautifully brings together what you've all been saying because it's a question of how much research somebody does about, you know, both the doctor themselves and also the patient, you know, how much context do they have, how much do they themselves know, and how much uncertainty do you want to ascribe to both what that particular doctor says and what all of medicine knows about some particular. Yeah, one of the fellows here last year was this guy, Nick Patterson, who is himself a statistician, and he had a disease where he felt that the doctor himself didn't understand the uncertainty associated with that disease. But you have to, he's you know, a data scientist essentially, and so you know, he had the wherewithal to question this doctor and wound up partnering with the doctor and kind of educating the doctor. But most people don't do that. Most people just have to make a judgment.
I mean, I think you're right. I think that doctors don't always know statistics.
Yeah.
And I think it's very common,
Or
for
it's
example.
presenting to them in this strange way that you would think that Hillary, you know, had 2/3 of the vote. Same kind of statistical presentation gets them to, you know, the way that it's phrased, getting back to words, sometimes can confuse people even if you're really intelligent, but the sort of translation of all of these statistics.
No, that's right. But
Yeah.
I have seen it go further than that. So, for example, I have seen doctors who make predictions about my situation. And you know, they're going by data that they look up in a book, and then they use that data to issue a conclusion. But they ignore things like what the base rate is, which makes it very hard to then use the information in the book to say something meaningful about my case. So I think that's a situation in which you're totally right. I think that if our experts, like doctors, knew a little more statistics,
Right.
then I think that their predictions would be much better, and we would all be better off.
I think people themselves could be Bayesian and update their views of the world as they go on, but yeah.
Do you think there's also some value in, I agree that going with the best prediction possible, but also acknowledging other predictions that are out there? Because I think this goes back to your saying, the doctor says, oh, you have, a stomach ache, but in the back of your mind that something else is wrong and there's a bunch of other possibilities. So it's most likely that, right, that he's correct, but not dismissing the other options as well.
I think you're totally right. So here's an example that I think brings that out. Suppose that you're at a restaurant and you're calculating how much each person owes, and you reach one result, and then your friend, who's basically your peer, so like they know as much math as you do, they have as much information as you do, they had as many drinks as you do, they reach a different result. What should you do? Should you just trust your result, or should you make a concession to the fact that someone else reached a different result? Surely the latter. Surely you should at least
Figure it out.
That's right.
Yeah.
Figure out what's going on. So I think you're right. I think that in many cases the right thing to do is to bring in the other information. The problem is what to do in cases where it's very hard to use the additional information to make a different decision. So in the restaurant case, you can just redo the math. But in other cases, you just need to take action. You need to take action soon. And then you may just have to trust one of your advisors. And
well, this is really useful, because if people said, like, what is the practical aspect of studying prediction and talking about prediction, the practical aspect would be to know where you are on that spectrum, okay, to historically understand how predictions are made, and they were made, and how they are made, and to have a little bit of a better perspective on evaluating the likelihood of truth in some prediction. So that's great. So does anybody here have more questions? Drew, you have anything? No? Anybody?
We hit on the AI question that
You guys?
there was a question about determinism and free will.
Yes, we didn't
that
really
we can,
explicitly talk about that.
That we can talk about. I mean, people are interested.
Sure, go for it.
So I think that people sometimes assume that acting freely is a matter of not being in a deterministic system. Mm-hmm. But I think that it's not at all clear that that's true. So one quick way to see it is to imagine that our cognitive systems are not deterministic. Instead, what happens is that we have some quantum event determine what's going to happen. We basically have the quantum equivalent of a coin toss that decides what we're going to do. Would we thereby be free? No. We would just be slaves to the outcome of our quantum coin toss. So acting freely is not a matter of escaping determinism. Philosophers disagree about just what it means to act freely. But one respectable view is that being in a deterministic world, a fully deterministic world, is compatible with being free. And the reason for that is analogous to a situation in which you have a friend and you know her really well, and you know that she loves to go to the movies on Friday. And you predict, and do so very accurately, that this Friday she's going to go to the movies. Does that mean that she did not act freely when she went to the movies? No. It just means that you were very good at predicting how she was going to exercise her freedom.
So does this get to, in other words, we already covered physics, but now let's go to life science, okay? So a lot of people say that the 21st century is the century of the brain, okay, and of understanding the brain, and we understand very little about it, okay? So if we got to the point where we understood the human brain as well as we understand the universe, albeit that's quite imperfectly, okay, but we can make pretty good predictions from physics, but in a kind of a priori way, and saying what word am I going to say next, right? If you had a perfect MRI and CT scan of my brain, you could figure out where my hand was going to go next, even though I don't know. Okay, so in some world where biology basically becomes physics, does that bear on this free will and determinism story? In other words, if you could actually determine what it is that causes what we perceive to be free will.
I mean, I think that whether it does or doesn't depends on the philosophical question of what free will is, but not on how good our science gets.
Okay.
So I think the main issue is whether you think of science as telling us just what will happen, or whether you think of science as telling us what must happen.
What about what might happen? Right now it's what might happen.
The might can apply to both cases.
Yeah.
So you can say, well, this is one option for what will happen, but you can also say this is one option for what must happen. So it's the difference between a prediction like the one in which I said my friend is going to the movies tonight, where I didn't say she had to, I just said that she would. So think about the brain scan you were describing. So suppose that the machine issues the prediction that I'm about to twitch my finger. Was that prediction that I would, or was that prediction that I had to? If it was just that I would, then it says nothing about free will. Because what the machine might be doing is issuing an accurate prediction about the way in which I'm going to exercise my free will. If the prediction instead is, that's what he must do, well, then your science is settling the question of free will. Then your science is telling us that we're not free. But as far as I can tell, when you look at the equations themselves, the equations of physics, there's nothing about like predictions about what must be the case. It's just predictions about what will be the case. So my impression is that physics taken straight does not speak to the issue of free will, in that it doesn't matter how deterministic physics gets. I mean, of course, the more deterministic it is, the more useful it'll be in terms of knowing what will happen. But again, that's a separate issue from the issue of free will. See.
I need a drink.
This is what happens when you spend too much time with a philosopher.
End with one more maybe response to the students about either like maybe how they feel about this question
Free
of
will and determinism, that seems like a good idea.
Broadly, how they feel about like the role of prediction in their life, like applying.
Cassandra's got something to add. So what do you think, Cassandra?
Or Q, you should ask a question.
I was trying and then you talked. So to say that again. Sorry, I'm just laughing about Drew, sorry. So what do you think about this?
I just kind of wanted to ask a follow-up question about how you thought morality kind of played into the idea of determinism and free will. So kind of the examples you've been talking about haven't been necessarily too high stakes, but once you introduce, if you have this idea where people, even if, like, if it's, you were kind of saying that whether or not the universe is deterministic doesn't really affect how free we are, because it'll just be, we'll be slaves to the quantum. I'm just repeating what you said at this point. But I don't know, if when you put morality in the equation, all of a sudden you have like an obligation to, do the right thing or treat people a certain way or act a certain way. I was just curious, how, if you don't think you have free will, you're just kind of, and you're just doing predictions
like a rule
again.
System
yeah, like how do you handle that?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a profound connection between free will and morality. I mean, the natural thought is, if you're not free, then you're not morally responsible. So for example, if I shoot someone, but the reason I do is because someone else forced me to do it, then I cannot be held morally responsible for doing that. So that connection is there. Now, the connection between prediction and morality is trickier. So here's an example. Suppose you have one of the predictions Elizabeth was talking about, where some algorithm predicts very accurately that someone is going to commit a crime. Does it follow from that they're not morally responsible if they do? No, of course it doesn't follow. Because all the algorithm told us is that it was likely that that person was going to act in a certain way, and it's compatible with that. That what it told us is that that person is very likely to exercise their free will in a way that leads to that result. So I think that the issue of predictability and free will is on the face of it, these are on the face of it separate issues. I mean, it's different if what you're doing is more than just predicting. So suppose that someone has a brain lesion that makes it impossible for them to control their impulses. Then you might predict on that basis that they're going to do something they shouldn't do in a particular context. And of course, that's a situation in which they're not morally responsible, at least not in the same way. But what's interesting there is that it's not just that you have prediction. You also have reasons for thinking that the person couldn't have done otherwise because of their impairment. And that's what matters to moral responsibility.
But no. We're going to get back to science, right? Because in physics in particular and other kinds of science, you always want to go to the limiting cases, right? So a brain tumor or some really horrible abnormality is just the limiting case of some very extreme thing wrong with your physiology that makes you do something. But as you go to smaller and smaller and smaller abnormalities, you just get to the range of people. And if we actually understood what that whole range was, then potentially we could predict the effect on their behavior. And then that becomes pretty darn deterministic.
I think that you're right that there's that gradation. I think there's no question about that. The point I was trying to make is that there's a difference between predictability and absence of moral responsibility.
Right.
So I think that whether or not there's moral responsibility depends in part on whether you were in a position to do otherwise.
But what if somebody's schizophrenic, right? And then they do something terrible as one personality without the rest of them knowing? You know, that's a condition where arguably they would even want to control themselves and they can't. So where's the morality judgment there, that they couldn't stop themselves?
I mean, certainly what the courts have determined in cases like that is that people in that situation are not always culpable. I mean, they might still demand that they go into an institution, but crucially, they won't find them guilty.
Morally guilty, essentially.
Well, legally guilty,
Legally guilty.
In this case. I mean, one thing that's important to know is that philosophers are largely not in the business of doing the kinds of things that, you know, newspaper columns do when they, you know, give advice about what to do in a tricky situation. So a philosopher is typically not in a good position to, you know, tell you whether a person with this or that disease did the right thing. I mean, it's typically on the more foundational issue on what it takes to be morally responsible. And I think the issue that emerged in the conversation with Cassandra is that the crucial link is between moral responsibility and free will, not between moral responsibility and predictability.
I get it.
I mean, of course, sometimes the reason you have predictability is because you don't have free will. And then, of course, in those cases, there's a link. But the crucial issue is not predictability. The crucial issue is the absence of free will.
Yeah.
I'll speak more broadly, I guess, to just, prediction in our daily lives. Something that I thought was really interesting is you really opened my eyes to the amount of prediction we use in our daily life. I don't think I ever really thought of, you know, understanding that you all would be here for this conversation to be an act of prediction. But I guess you can take like getting stood up on a date. When someone sets a date, you assume that they'll be there. But there are plenty of stories of times when people don't show up. So I guess it's made me think in a different way about the way that we operate in our daily lives, the assumptions we make, and the social contracts that stand between people that to act in a certain way and follow a certain set of sort of unwritten rules. So I think that's really interesting.
No, that's right. And I love the example where someone gets stood up. The reason you're so shocked is a measure of the force with which you were predicting that it would work. So I love that as a test case.
Yeah. So yeah, but I think I would. The thing that I take away as a thread from this whole thing is this notion of how far out into the future, this sort of sense of scale of how good humans are at evaluating uncertainty, right? So your uncertainty in whether or not someone's going to show up for a date is quite low. You're sure that they're going to show up, especially if it's somebody you know well, right? But again, you know, if you're, say, in a business with somebody now, whether that business is going to exist tomorrow, you're pretty sure it will. Whether that business is going to exist in 20 years, you have no idea, right? And so it's sort of like there's this curve of uncertainty, just like the hurricane, you know, sort of going out into the future.
You're right. Though, of course, there's something else that's true at the same time, which is that sometimes it's easy to make reliable predictions if all you're predicting is that someone will do something at some point. But it's very hard to predict whether they'll do it that's right, in some fixed amount of time. So, for example, if you're trying to predict whether someone will have children, then you know, I think for most people you can do that, you know, better than chance.
Right.
But of course, whether they're going to, you know, have children within the next year, you know, that's much harder to predict. So, like, that's one dimension in which long-term predictions.
I'll just give you a funny factoid. So, one of the people that we'll talk to later in the course is Brendan Mead, who can predict earthquakes, and he can predict that in a particular region there will be a particular kind of earthquake in a particular time period, which is really pretty amazing. but not on what particular day. So you can predict within a window the statistical likelihood of all different kinds of earthquakes in all different kind of places on Earth, but that narrowing it down to exactly when is a whole different and harder problem. Exactly. All right. So I want to just thank everybody for coming to this excellent conversation. And do we need to do anything else for you guys?
No, I think we
No?
got
Room tone, do you want like a, do we need like a nice ending?
An ending, yeah.
So like another ending like that, but just holding with them and not talking to us.
Okay.
Try one more of those.
As in, I'm not supposed to say anything after I say thank you. Okay. Okay. Anyway, so I just want to thank you all for coming. This was a terrific conversation, and I hope that everybody who wasn't here to enjoy it with us will enjoy it in a more remote way. That's stupid. Anyway, this is what I mean about the spontaneous conversation going out the window. Anyway.
You're cool. Don't worry about it.
Okay.
We're good.
All right, as long as you
Fine.
guys are cool with it. All right, good.
Okay, yeah, I think we said enough.
Then let's just do room
Room
tone.
tone again.
All right. We don't need cameras for room tone.